All right, welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, and I'm the community coordinator with the Stewardship Network. And we are here to present the TSN webcast for May 2025. First, we'd like to tell you a little bit about us. So TSN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 plus place-based TSN member communities across the Great Lakes with emerging presences across the country. Excuse me. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of each month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. So we recommend that you put those on your calendar and remind yourself to join us. And you can also register for upcoming webcasts via our website. So our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more about a few of those aspects of our mission. So we connect the specialized knowledge we've collected from and for TSN member communities, and we share it as widely as possible throughout our network. We equip, we remove hurdles for TSN member communities so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. And finally, we mobilize. Through our TSN member communities, we make collaborative ecological stewardship accessible to all. Now, we want to talk a little bit more about the mobilize portion of that mission because it is, of course, field season. So everybody here, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. We really appreciate it. But of course, we must be talking at this beautiful time of year about one of our favorite programs that we do at the Stewardship Network, our Spring Challenge. So last month during our April webcast, we kicked off the Spring Challenge on April 9th, and it'll be going until June 30th of this year. And our tagline is do more together. So we want to tell you about some of the great updates we've had since last time we spoke about the Spring Challenge and all of the great work you all are doing out in your local communities. So far through week 4, we have over 2,100 total hours of stewardship reported. That is over 730 total participants. And we also want to mention that we feel a big surge coming because this reporting is never exactly linear. Things tend to get more serious. Field season tends to wrap up in mid to late May. So we're trending well so far, but we do really encourage folks to report early and often because that allows us to celebrate all of your great work throughout the year. And there are also some other great reasons for you to report early and often that I'll mention in a little bit. But another reminder that any work that you've done since April 9th, you can still report for the Spring Challenge. So if you haven't gotten around to reporting that work day you did, the weekend after we kicked off or anything like that, you can feel free to do that retroactively up until April 9th. So a little bit of background. Through the years, the Spring Challenge has gone through different iterations. It was built to increase the impact and awareness of collaborative stewardship efforts and began in 2008. Some of you may remember Garlic Mustard Challenge or Spring Invasive Species Challenge. And we know that the work is all happening, but the Spring Challenge asks us to do more together, whatever our role is. So that prompts me to give you another reminder that all of the work counts. So whether you are a volunteer, we totally appreciate all of those hours, a volunteer coordinator, but also professional stewards. You're more than welcome to report the hours that you spend out conducting stewardship in many of the different categories. We ask that you don't report things like admin and travel, etc. But it's open to all sorts of stewards, both volunteer and professional. So we encourage you to visit stewardshipnetwork.org/spring. And once again, report early and often because we will see, again, in a couple slides here, some of the incentives that we have for you to send in your reports on a weekly basis if you are able. A reminder that hours remain the primary metric. So regardless of the category you submit to, hours is the metric that is shared between all of them. And we will shout out your rolling do more achievements and honor those that do most at the end. So we'll have awards at the very end to celebrate. And of course, throughout the whole thing, we're celebrating the collective impact that we are all able to have together. So the reporting form accepts multiple categories in one entry, so you can do multiple events in the same entry if you would like. There is also the opportunity to directly upload a spreadsheet. So if you're already tracking your stewardship work in a different way, you can upload that spreadsheet directly rather than filling out the form. And this is what the lead up has been. TSN Spring Challenge Boost. They made a splash in 2023 and 2024, so they are back in 2025. So these are some of the great boosts that are available to you, but I must say that the Rogue Hoe in the top right corner has actually already been claimed. So I encourage you, if you see anything on this screen that you like, to report again early and often, and you can do it on a weekly basis for the weekly drawings and get your chance to win one of these great boosts. We have a lot of great folks that have already won them this year, and we're so happy and appreciative to all of the folks that have contributed to our prize pantry, because we simply could not have done it without all of you. So with that, I'd like to move on to our presentation today. So our guest today is Chris Hoving, Adaptation Specialist at the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. And the presentation today is The Armadillos Are Moving, but Karners Are Trapped. Neonatives, Managed Relocation, and What to Do About Wildlife Climate Refugees. So with that, I would like to invite Chris to share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Rob.
You are very welcome. Yep, that looks great to me.
Okay, excellent. We'll get started then. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. I've sat in your seats many times. I love these Wednesday webinars. Try to make it to them whenever I can. So it's fun to be on the other side of the screen, so to speak. So I want to give you the take-home message right off the bat today, just in case you have to go out into the field or you get interrupted or lose your internet connection or whatever. That way you'll know what I was talking about. And you'll also understand why I'm maybe talking about different things and trying to bring it together at the end. But really, today what I'm trying to do is convince you that some wildlife species that are climate refugees should not always be treated as invasive species. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. And that we really need to take it on a case-by-case basis. For a long time, we've sort of had this model in conservation of something was not here in our place 200 years ago, and now it's becoming abundant. Therefore, it's a non-native invasive species, and we should reduce its numbers so that the native species can continue to thrive. That's a great model. It's really how we do a lot of our operations on our own state wildlife lands. But it starts to fall apart a little bit when you start talking about climate change and species that are changing or expanding their geographic range. And we'll talk about what that is, why that is, and maybe how we can start to incorporate them into our land management models. So that's where we're going today. Before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about myself, just so you know where I'm coming from, who I am. These are some of my professional identities, and sort of gives you a sense of why I'm talking about the things that I'm talking about, maybe the things that I know well and the things that maybe I don't know well. So I'm trained as a landscape ecologist. I have a graduate degree in ecology and another one in wildlife biology, but both projects were at very broad spatial scales and long time spans as well. So if you hear me talking about, scale is important, that's always a good trigger. If you hear someone say scale is important in a natural areas context, it means they're either a landscape ecologist or they've taken a landscape ecology course. I'm also a restorationist. I worked for 5 years with the Michigan DNR, restoring oak savannas and prairie fens in Southwest Michigan, working with private landowners primarily and NGOs. So I've got a lot of experience with in the field working on particularly those two systems, but just all the thorny issues of restoration ecology. I'm also did a stint as the statewide endangered species coordinator. So I have a knowledge of what species in the state of Michigan are endangered, why they're endangered, and conservation actions that are needed to, keep them on the landscape, keep them from going extinct. And then I'm also currently working as the adaptation specialist for the Michigan DNR. So I'm sort of our climate change point person within Michigan. Not every state agency has one. I'm a little biased, but I think every state agency should, since climate is changing in every state. But yeah, I look at specifically climate change issues, how it affects our infrastructure, how it affects the species, and what we can do to adapt to this changing climate. So those are some of the background, some of the things that I bring to the talk today. And I also want to talk a little bit about the Michigan DNR Wildlife Division um, and who we are. Often we take, especially people within the agency, sort of take it for granted that, people know what we are. But I think what we're seeing a lot, especially at the federal level, is a lot of agencies and programs, people didn't really understand what they did or what they're losing if that agency or program goes away. And so I think it may be beholden on us to toot our own horn a little bit every now and then. So Michigan DNR Wildlife Division is the state wildlife agency for the state of Michigan. Every state has a fish and wildlife agency. Sometimes they're combined with parks, sometimes with fish. In Michigan, we've sort of got our own agency. Fish is a separate agency and parks is a separate agency, all under the Michigan DNR. Our mission is to conserve, enhance, and restore the state's wildlife, ecosystems, and natural communities for the benefit of future and current generations. So we're not just about vertebrates. We're not just about deer. We're not just about hunting. We do a lot of work on all of those things, but our mandate and the work that we do is actually much broader. It includes ecosystems, natural communities, and when we talk about wildlife, we're including vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, even fungi sometimes. So we're responsible for managing, for the benefits of the people of Michigan, about 10,000 different species. Mostly that's insects, but it's a pretty large number of species that we're responsible for, and that's native species. We're responsible for 407 state endangered species. So the state of Michigan has its own endangered species list, and we manage those species. And then we have 297 watch list species. So together, that's 704 rare species that we manage as a state. We also have 65 game species that we manage, and we set hunting seasons and harvest quotas based on what is sustainable for those populations. We also manage 460,000 acres of state wildlife public lands. And then in addition, we co-manage with another state agency, the Forest Resources Division, another 4 million acres of state lands. So it's a very large area. It's much larger than most other states, both in terms of just state land, but also state wildlife land. So I also want to say a word about funding and expectations here, just because we are going through a rough patch financially, and we'll try to be transparent about that. We're currently down to about 160 staff. We had 200 in the year 2000, so we're at about 75% of where we used to be. Costs have gone up. I mean, we all know about inflation. Costs for us just to have the staffing and to buy the gas for the equipment to go out and cut invasive species or whatever. All those costs have gone up about 30%, but our revenue has been declining because our revenue is largely tied to hunting fees. And we've had cost savings, and we've been cutting our budget for several years now, and we'll be it's forecast to go into the future because our revenues are declining. But we're really reaching the limits of cost savings and frugality, and at this point, probably we're going to be seeing a reduction in services going forward. And so the expectation, the work that we do, going back to our mission, is to conserve wildlife. So there'd be less wildlife, less safety. I mean, we respond to bears that show up in cities and towns, things like that. Less public lands that'll be less clean, or maybe not as taken care of as they used to be. More invasive species, possibly more species extinctions if this continues too long. So that's the sort of thing that if funding isn't changed to keep up with inflation and keep up just with the needs for wildlife conservation, we can expect consequences. Just want to throw that out there. With that, I'm going to jump into a quick outline of the talk. And again, My style on giving talks tends to be to jump around a little bit and then tie things together at the end. And so you'll see that, and I want to give an outline so you have a sense of like where we're going. First, I'm going to start with a bit of social science. I think when we're talking about invasive species, there's a scientific aspect to it, but there's also an emotional aspect, and I want to explore that a little bit with moral foundations theory. We'll talk a little bit about the climate context. Why are we talking about species geographic range shifts? And why is that going to be an issue going into the future? We'll talk a little bit about the armadillos that are coming. We'll talk a little bit about one of my favorite species, the federally endangered Karner blue butterfly, and how they're trapped in a climate sense. And then we'll talk very briefly at the end about what do we do, what can we do, what should we be doing, how should we be thinking about neonative species or climate refugee wildlife. So with that, I will jump into it. So moral foundations theory. So within social science has different branches. Moral foundations theory is a part of evolutionary psychology, and it was um, popularized by this really fantastic book that I read several years ago called Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So it's sort of there'll be a book of like, here's the science of salt, or here's the science of, this or that. This was a book written by Jonathan Haidt, a professor who studies moral foundations theory on this is what moral foundations theory is. And I thought it was particularly useful because it's broader than just a Western perspective. It's a broader perspective on why people develop moral sensibilities and how what those moral sensibilities look like when you do, surveying of large numbers of people and focus groups and really sort of dig into, how does this work from a scientific standpoint. And what the theory says is that humans, when they're basing their moral intuitions or moral compass, tend to do it based on 6 different foundations. He often calls these sort of like taste buds. They're different ways that humans define good and evil and what is right and wrong, and then try to balance the 6 different things to try to come up with, what is the right thing to do or the right course of action. So why does this matter for climate refugees? Well, a big part of it gets down to this idea of um, feelings of care and harm. That's one of the moral foundations, and then the sanctity degradations, the purity of something, um, are feelings that get really tied up in how we interact with the natural world, especially when we start talking about native species versus non-native species. Um, so we, care harm might be looking at something and saying, okay, when an invasive species comes into this community, it takes up space and makes the habitat less good for this other animal that we care about, and then that animal suffering. So there's a care harm component to that. But there's also the sanctity degradation part of it, which is a little less, those are big words, but it gets to the purity. When we ask, what is a high quality natural community? We're often thinking about, like, say, this oak savanna that I've got as my background here, something that has very few invasive species in it, has a wide diversity of native species, looks and functions similar to the community might have done, pre-settlement, pre-1800, pre sort of history in this part of the world. But when we start digging in a little bit, that those when we start talking about what's right and wrong, good and bad, what's the value of a place, we're starting to get into an emotional landscape. And so I want people to be, as we talk about these things, to be aware of their emotional landscape. So as we start talking about, what's invasive, who gets to define what is invasive, what is native, who gets harmed, what gets harmed by non-native species, and what high quality community is, what your high quality goal is for an area versus not, those tend to dredge up some emotion. So I just want people to be aware of their own emotions, not to suppress them, and be aware that there is this sort of science of, it's weird, science looking at how humans differentiate good and evil. But they're also facts, scientific facts. And I'll be sort of moving off of moral foundations into the facts part of it for the next in a couple slides. But facts about the climate changing, some species are shifting their range. Some ranges are just contracting, they're not shifting. And humans affect these things, both the climate and uh, wildlife communities, by their choices in how to act and when not to act. And both feelings and facts matter. I want to be clear about that. So one more slide on the moral foundations theory and sort of transition it into the invasive species thing. So here's a cartoon that I pulled off of a really interesting article that I read earlier this week on how cartoonists are getting the whole human immigrants, human invasion, human refugee conversation wrong. So, take the it's a humorous cartoon, but take it with a grain of salt. And really what they pointed out was that there are three sort of distinct things that sometimes get confused in our discussions about human migration. And that's that immigration is generally moving with the intent to assimilate or strengthen the existing community. So you're coming into another community and you want to be a part of it. Invasion is moving with the intent to change that other community, to convert or suppress the existing community. And refugee is usually not someone who's intending to move at all. They're just fleeing something that has become dangerous. And so when we talk about invasive species invasions, I do want to sort of throw in there with the climate change part that moving species, especially if climate change is forcing them to move, they're not moving necessarily with intent. So neither immigration or invasion really captures the word there. Sometimes they're just leaving a hostile climate. I also want to talk a little bit and sort of transition from that idea to this importance of scale. I warned you that I'm a landscape ecologist and that I would bring up scale, and here it is. So when we talk about the value of having a native community of plants and animals working together, it's largely because those plants and animals evolved together and they evolved to work with each other or to eat each other or to interact in some way that lends the whole ecosystem some resilience and some coherence. And that happens over millions of years. Range shifts happen much, much faster, one year to 1,000 years, depending on how fast a species can move. And then we have this other thing that sort of makes Michigan and the upper Midwest kind of unique in that we have these ice ages. And the ice ages didn't happen millions of years ago. They happened more recently. So a lot of the species sort of come and go on Michigan's landscape at the 2000 or at the hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands of year scale. So there's some interesting sort of interactions that go on there. So the ice ages, an interesting sort of side note, we're currently in the ice ages time period. Ice ages are still happening every 10 to 30,000 years. Well, or every 100,000 years, we get a warm spell that lasts 10 to 30,000 years. Our last one was last cold period, glaciated period, was about 13,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. So we're in the middle of one of the warm periods, but the warm periods are actually a lot shorter than the ice periods, which I hadn't realized until I did some digging into it, which last like 100,000 years. And we've had a bunch of them over the last 2 million years. And then I also wanted to just mention at this importance of scale, when we talk about historic range, we're really nailing that here in Michigan to about 200 years ago. If we were in Europe, they talk about native as going back to the time of Romans. So they go back like 900 to 1,000 years. So we're looking at 200, maybe 200 to 400 years. And with that, I want to jump into a little trivia time. So if you could drop in the chat what you think the historic range of bison was relative to Michigan. I'm a Michigan DNR person, so I'm very parochial. My world ends at the borders with Wisconsin and Indiana, Ohio, and Ontario. So where in Michigan, or did we even have bison in Michigan?
We've got one vote or two votes for no bison.
Okay.
We've got one whole state, most of the lower peninsula, all of Michigan, southern Michigan, where the prairie was, a few more votes for lower peninsula. So it seems like quite a range of guesses so far.
Yep. Yeah. Not surprising because other than in the zoo or at uh, a range or a farm where they're growing them, we don't really see bison in Michigan. So the person who said where the prairies are was the closest. So for all you plant nerds out there, like Voss is like the book for plants in this area. Baker would be the mammal equivalent of it. It's just a fantastic book. It's been out of print since 1983 though, so you have to find used copies. But it's got these great maps of the historic range, and bison were found in the southern two tiers of counties and maybe up into Allegan County. So really just at the southern edge. So let's do another one. I got a couple of these here. Caribou. Reindeer, same species as they have in Scandinavia, but a different subspecies. These would have been woodland caribou.
Couple votes for the upper peninsula,
Mhm.
northern, lower, and UP. Yeah, lots of upper peninsula guesses so far.
Okay.
Canadian border, all of the UP. Yeah, it's looking like most people are saying UP or northern lower peninsula.
That Canadian borders actually covers it pretty good. So you had all of the UP, but you also had populations coming in through Sarnia, connected to Ontario through Sarnia, and Ontario, all the way down to the Detroit area, surprisingly. So yeah, we had caribou where we didn't have bison. Here's one of my favorites, Canada lynx. I did my master's research on Canada lynx in the Northeast, mostly in Maine.
So we've got a vote for statewide. We've got most of the state, a few more statewide. Where
All
the
right.
forests were.
Yep, you guys got it. It was statewide. It was found as far south as Indiana and northern Indiana, northern Ohio. So this was the species that we had throughout the state. At this point, we get visitors crossing every once in a while into the UP from Ontario, at the very far east end of the UP, but they, at least in my tenure here, none have stayed. All right, let's do another one here. Possum, Virginia possum.
We've got all of Michigan, everywhere, the entire continent, all of Michigan. Not Michigan, we have one.
Okay.
A couple for lower Michigan or lower peninsula.
Yeah, well, according to Baker, there's archaeological evidence for them just from Berrien County. Otherwise, we don't have any evidence of them in Michigan until the mid to late 1800s. And there's actually a really interesting study that was done by Phil Myers at U of M, redoing a study that was done in the 1930s and really documented the change in distribution of possum. But they have a naked tail and naked ears, and they will get frostbite, and so they are very directly limited by minimum winter temperatures, and they've been expanding their range. And at this point, they're found pretty much statewide. Last one, earthworms. I'm told that you guys had a webinar on this earlier in the year, so some of you already know this one.
We got a lot of none, not native, not in North America, not in the US. So it's sounding like there's a lot of they weren't here.
Yeah. Well, it depends on the species of earthworm. There are a couple of species of earthworms that are native to North America. However, they were not native to Michigan from the historic range. So interestingly, earthworms can't grow under glaciers. They can't live under glaciers. And so their range was basically down in, Indiana, Ohio, beyond the southern edge of the glaciation front. And then once the glaciers retreated, the earthworms started to shift their range north, and they're still shifting their range north. But earthworms only invade at a meter per year. And so over 13,000 years of melting, they've moved 13,000 meters, which would be 13 kilometers or about 7 miles. So they're very, very, very slow range expansion. But it's happening. All the earthworms that we have here in Michigan were brought here either by bait or in horticulture. Someone's bucket that they pot that they planted their plant in or something like that. So not a native species to Michigan. So speaking of ice ages, I wanted to sort of go back instead of talking about like the big uh, landscape extent. I want to talk a little bit about the time extent, like how big is climate change right now? And I think XKCD, they do great comics. They're very funny, but they're also great science communication. And he basically said, well, what if we make up a unit of measurement that says of climate change that says ice age is one, the difference between this, recent long-term averages and you know 1800 pre-industrial climate to the ice age is 1 unit. How much do we expect in by 2100? And it's about 1 unit. So we expect it to change, the climate to change, especially in this part of the world, by about the same amount as the ice ages if we get the sort of worst case scenario warming and we don't do anything about climate emissions. So yeah, where we are today is about a quarter of a ice age unit, and we could be looking up to one within the next. He says 86 years. I think this is a little older comic. I think it would be closer to 75 years now. So where are we today? These are global average temperatures. This is one of my favorite sort of visualizations for it. And I look at this one just about every day. It's one of my home screens that I have on my work computer. Each line is the daily average global temperature for that day, for that year. And so each line is a year. The orange line is last year. The red line is this year. And the dotted lines are some recent long-term averages. So the averages between for the 80s and 90s or the 90s to 2020s. And you can see we're about a half to 1 degree Celsius of warming, which is about 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. We can also look at like where we're heading from a climate change perspective. So this is a map off of that NOAA did just for Michigan, looking at like Michigan's predicted temperature going forward. And they've done this for each state. It's last time I checked, it's still up on the web at that address. So the orange line is the observed temperatures in Michigan, average temperatures, and you can see it bounces around quite a bit. We have a big difference between a warm summer and a cool summer, and same with the winter. The gray area is using the climate models and sort of running them backwards to see, does the model fit with past observations? And it does pretty good. And then the green is lower emissions, red is higher emissions. So there's a big difference in how much warming we can expect in Michigan, depending on whether we go with a low carbon energy transition or if we delay that or don't do it. So where we are now compared to the 1900 to 2000 mean, we're about 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And just as a note, 1 degree Celsius is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm just using Fahrenheit because most people in the US intuit that better. Best case scenario, the middle of the road for the best case scenario climate change models is 6 degrees Fahrenheit. So about, in the next 75 years, we could get as much warming as we got in the last 125 years. And worst case scenario is 12 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about an ice age unit right there. And so that's what we're looking at as far as, so there's a big difference. We can make a big difference depending on, energy policy decisions that are made nationally and globally. But from our perspective, we can't change the climate. We just have to react to it as conservationists. So what does 3 degrees warming look like? Well, what does that look like on the landscape? Like how far away is it to get to someplace that's 3 degrees warmer than where I am right now? It gives me kind of a sense of like geographic range changes. How big are we talking? So 3 degrees Fahrenheit, you're looking at within state sort of changes. Iron County becomes like Otsego County. So northern low, or the UP becomes more like the northern lower becomes like middle of the state, and middle of the state becomes like southern lower. So that's just sort of putting it geographically. So the length of those arrows gives you a sense of like best case scenario, we're still looking at a half a peninsula movement in range changes or what species are adapted to. If we go with 12 degrees warming, then we have to zoom out to a US map, and Gogebic County becomes like Worth County in Missouri. Bay County becomes like Lynn County in Texas. So putting that on the map, that's what it starts to look like. Those are pretty much unfathomable changes, but it does give you a sense of how big how disruptive a 12-degree change would be. Which brings me to armadillos. Armadillos are coming. So the historic range of the armadillo was not in the United States. They weren't here. They were native to Mexico, Central America, and Southern America. However, by 1995, they were common throughout Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and then across the Gulf states over to Georgia and Florida. However, armadillos are already here. Well, not already here. They're almost here. They're close. So we have had reports of armadillos found near Holland. There's another report in iNaturalist in the Thumb area. So we see them, once every couple of years, we'll get reports of armadillos. Their current range where they're resident and breeding is middle of Illinois, middle of Indiana. But you do get occasional rare sightings in Michigan, as well as Minnesota and Wisconsin. So what do we call this species that's not even technically native to the United States if we go by 1492, but is now fairly common and expanding? Is it an invasive species? Well, it kind of is. They carry diseases. They have a lot of impacts on ground nesting birds. They also have some beneficial effects as far as like creating climate refugia for other species and things like that. Do we call it a climate refugee? Do we call it just a non-local being? That's a term you hear more often in the indigenous community. Do we just call it a straight up disease vector because it carries leprosy? Do we call it neonative? That's the term that's often used in the academic literature. But it matters which one we call it because it affects that emotional side and whether we look at a landscape that has armadillos in it as good or bad, and what do we choose to do about that? So let's switch to the Karner blue butterfly, which has a slightly different story. It's federally endangered. It's an oak savanna indicator. It's very small, about the size of your thumbnail. It's extremely climate sensitive. There have been many studies that have been done on this species and show that it's one of our most climate sensitive species that we know about in Michigan. But they can only disperse about 200 meters. So that's like 200 times faster than an earthworm, which is fast, but it's not going to get you very far when climate is changing at the even at the 3 degree Fahrenheit. All the Karner blue butterflies in Michigan could fit in that orange box that's on that map. There's only about 100 miles from the southernmost population in Michigan, which is the southernmost population in the whole range, to the northernmost population in Michigan up in Lake County. So there's been some, like I said, this is a species that's been studied pretty extensively for its climate vulnerability. This is one of the papers that sort of took a modeling approach and said, well, let's look at the climate where the species currently occurs, and then use climate models to predict where will that climate be in the future. It's called climate niche modeling. Has some strengths, has some weaknesses, just like any type of vulnerability assessment, but it does give you a sense of the geographic challenge that this butterfly is facing. So there's a map from that paper, one of the figures, and I'll sort of zoom in here so that we can all see it. So the map on the left in the green sort of takes the climate at all of those black dots. That's where the current Karner blue butterflies currently exist, or where we have historical data for them, and says this is the climate, and then looks at the climate models in the 2030s and says, where would that climate be in the 2030s? And the green area is where that would be. Now, the climate is different between, say, Minnesota and upstate New York. And so if you say, maybe the butterflies are adapted to these different climates in the West and the East, and so you just use the butterflies west of Lake Michigan to build your model, then you get the orange model. And if you use just the butterflies to the east of Lake Michigan, then you get the blue model. And we don't really know if they're which ones, we can't just ask the butterflies, which ones you're adapted to. It's something that's going to take further study. But as a modeling exercise, they sort of used both and compared them. But I think what's really interesting from a climate refugee standpoint is that on both models, regardless of which way you run the models, the green dots the green doesn't overlap with the black. It doesn't overlap. And by the 2030s, climate models predict that there won't be overlap between where the butterflies currently are and the climate that they evolved to, and that they've existed in up until fairly recently. And then if you go with the 2050s, sort of move that forward, the 2050s mapped areas don't overlap much, if at all, with the 2030s, and the 2080s don't overlap much with the 2050s. And so this is a species that, if it needs to be moved for climate change, it would need to be moved every couple of decades to track its climate. The climate, and this is closer to the 12-degree Fahrenheit scenario. So worst case scenario, you would have to move the species multiple times. Another good reason not to change the climate that drastically. So what is a land manager's responsibility for Karner blue butterflies? Karner blue butterflies, because they can only go 200 meters, they can't track their climate niche alone. And so it opens up the question, do we as humans, because we're changing the climate, because we've affected their systems, do we have an obligation to help? And if so, what does helping look like when the challenges are that big? Should we help? And if helping is successful, if we successfully move the butterflies to a new area, what should we call them? If they become abundant in that new area, are they becoming invasive, or are they a refugee? Is that like success or not success? Is it a neonative? It gets really thorny, but it's also really urgent. I mean, 2030s is literally 5 years, starts 5 years from now. It's 5 to 15 years. So what to do? What I would say is there's not a real easy answer to this. I think we need to consider our emotional responses when we decide what we're valuing, what is high quality in a changing climate, and also make sure that we're grounding it in the science. Exactly how big a change is climate change, how disruptive, and what can we what can we do? What's the urgency? Those sorts of things, so that we don't under-adapt or over-adapt. I think we need to avoid the temptation to call all climate refugees or all species that are shifting their range invasive species. But in some cases, like this armadillo here, in some cases it is going to we probably will need to treat it as an invasive species. So I would say each species is unique and each place is unique. I know people hate it when the answer is it depends. But I think it does depend. Each place is unique. Sometimes they add resilience, sometimes they disrupt. So real quick take-home message is climate is changing, and it's changing in a disruptive way. Range expansions are not necessarily invasions. Species are diverse in their need and their ability to move themselves. So it's going to depend species by species and place by place. And we need to evaluate the risks and opportunities on a place by place, species by species basis. And that's all I have. At this point, I can take questions if we've got time.
Yes, we absolutely have time. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very thought-provoking, and as you said, it's sometimes hard to not have the full, answer or a clean answer for some of these things. But really appreciate the presentation. So I guess I'll start with a couple of questions from the audience, then I also have a few for myself as well. So one question was, could you share the source for the data for this data for New England, please? I'm not exactly sure what data they're referring to, but do you recognize that? Or maybe Luca, if you could share more information about what data set you're looking for in the chat.
Yeah, so if it's the data for the model,
I'm seeing in the chat, it was the graph Chris uses as his home screen.
the graph I used as my home screen.
I think it was the temperature variation by year.
Oh, yes, yes.
Mhm.
So yeah, that one is only at the global scale, but it is run through. Um, let me look it up real quick. It's called Climate Reanalyzer, climatereanalyzer.org, and so
Okay,
you can go to that one. It's through the University of Maine.
great. Thank you for that. So we have a question from Doug about armadillos. So are they still present across their historic range as well as their expanded range? If so, does that suggest factors in addition to climate have contributed to their range expansion? For example, elimination of predators or natural barriers?
Um, so I'm not sure about their range outside of Michigan. Like I said, I'm a Michigan DNR person, so my expertise is pretty parochial. However, I do know that the reasons for range expansion are rarely just climate, but they often include climate as an important caveat. So the initial expansion into the United States was a change in habitat, specifically fire suppression in Texas, and which allowed shrubification, and that then allowed armadillos to move into the area. So it was definitely early on. It was a land use change that brought them probably as far north as the Missouri area, and then beyond that, it's probably been they've been slowed down but still creeping northward, and it looks a little more like it's climate change. But it's something that honestly I'd like to do some find some collaborators to do some research on to really nail that down.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I also have a clarification from Luca. So it was actually the model for what are the trees and shrubs that should be looked at to move northward in New England, is the model or graph that they were looking for.
Ah, okay. So the the where I would go for that information would be the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which is part of the Forest Service. They've got some really great science-based um, papers and lists of species to plant in different states and different regions based on climate change.
Great, thank you for that. So then we have a question from Doug here. So for a species like the Karner blue that is host dependent, what if their host plant doesn't expand its range? Would we move entire plant communities as well?
Yeah, that's where it becomes a big challenge. So the host plant for Karner blue only has one host plant. It's the blue lupin. It's a very large seeded plant, and so it it throws its seeds, but it doesn't throw them that far. So it would be something that would need to be moved as well. And then, as you move more species, the uh, chance of one of those species becoming overabundant increases, and so then you get risks, and then you have to weigh the risks of moving something versus the risks of not moving something. That's why the answer is it depends. Sometimes it is an invasive species issue, and sometimes it's not.
Thank you very much for that, and I encourage folks to continue sharing your questions in the Q&A if you would like. I believe it's Michelle is asking, do we need to consider the soils in translocation of plant communities as well, or is there any work that's been done about that?
Um, to some degree, yes. So for most species, you're going to be wanting considering moving them from the soils that they're native to or where they're found in nature to similar soils if they can be found in another area. And so that will be, especially for Karner blue, that becomes an issue. If you saw one of the maps had like their range going down the Appalachian spine, and there's the climate at the tops of mountains might be similar, but the soils are going to be very different from the sandy soils that we have on our savannas here.
Thank you for that. So then we have a question. Could you share the research paper regarding Karner blues from 2016 again, please?
Yep, that was Hallfors et al. Hallfors, I think. And actually, let me see if I can bring this up and then share.
Thank you, everybody, for the great
Yep.
questions, by the way.
Yeah, so there's the title. It's an ecological adaptations.
Got it. Thank you very much. So, I was just thinking, I found it so intriguing when you mentioned the aspect of the differences in time period or state of ecosystems between how we reference it in the US versus how folks reference it in Europe. And
Yep.
so I'm not sure exactly what my question is here, but it is just kind of blowing my mind. So maybe if I'm curious for you if you've discussed with any colleagues in Europe about how their approaches are similar or different from ours, and wondering about how much the climate has potentially changed in that 600-year period versus 200-year period, and all of that just is very intriguing to me and illustrates the point that you really, by your most earnest estimate or calculation, select a time or a state to orient yourself to. But yeah, just generally speaking, how do you see that conversation happening between folks in this profession in based on those differing time periods?
Yeah, I think it has to do with how we establish those baselines, and it gets back to that moral foundations theory of what we consider pure. Often we're doing it because we consider that was like the empty time when there weren't people, and yet a lot of us are coming to understand as we work with our tribal and indigenous partners that there were people here and they were managing the landscape. So there really isn't a non-peopled time period. Um,
Hmm.
but there's also a practical aspect to it as well, where we don't have uh, Western scientific data. I'll put it that way. Um, we only have it back to a certain point when there were observers on the landscape, and so in this part of the state, If you know French, you could probably go back to the 1600s, but most of us are not looking at the French records. We're looking at the English accounts from settlers, and that's generally around 1800 is when people really started settling in Michigan and changing the landscape.
Hmm. Hmm. That's really interesting. And then maybe just a final question or point to make is I appreciate what you were saying about trying to remove our emotional responses to things in this. And of course, I think I would speak for most people in the audience, including myself and even you, Chris, that, an emotional connection to the environment is a driving force to why we get into this field, right?
Yeah.
So we know that we care about the environment, in some ways logically, or and then in other ways just really kind of emotionally or even spiritually. And I wanted to acknowledge or appreciate that challenge because I'm thinking for myself, like, you know, I have an affinity for possums and I'm always telling people about possums and like, don't be mean to possums because they're like our only marsupial and they're so interesting and cool. Then seeing that their historic range was so limited and now is so wide and thinking about what impacts that could have and how they could be considered an invasive species in those areas, et cetera, is really interesting to me. So maybe the last question, a big one, or if you have any advice for folks on how to navigate that when you have such an affinity for the environment, for these species, you inherently want these species to exist, right? You'd rather them exist than not. But then how do you reconcile that with the reality of what their continued existence means for, either practically speaking, how possible it is, or what impacts it could have on other species, indirectly or directly?
Yeah, I think the answer, and sort of I want to correct uh, uh, what you said, and how you understood what I said a little bit, and that's that I don't think we suppress the emotion side, but we hold it equally with the science so that we're aware of both. And if they conflict, then we just need to be aware that there's some dissonance there. We don't like cognitive dissonance, but it's important to be aware of it when it's there. Um, but to be aware of why we value things and that we value them and that those emotions are valid. I mean, it's why we, like you said, it's why we got into this field, most of us. It's sort of like a bedrock thing. So we want to be aware of it and value it. Um, One thing that it has changed for me, understanding that tribal folks view that value differently than I view it, um, has helped me understand that. And the other data point is that inner city people like myself, I grew up in the city, um, tend to view like anything that's green is like valuable. If it's not pavement, it's valuable. Even if it's just, all invasives, non-natives, it's still, there's a value there. And so I think appreciating the high quality natural communities for what they are and that we do need to keep invasive species out of those, but also valuing an invasive mess in an area where people don't have access to green space. There's a value to that. Or, indigenous people may be valuing things because they're fellow beings. And so they have this more peer-to-peer rather than steward relationship. Knowing that other people, they still value nature, but they value it differently helps us to create a bigger tent, I think. And so I think it's important to be aware of our values and the values of others, and that those
Mhm.
are rooted in emotions.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I think, and sorry, thank you for that clarification. Because again, yeah, it's not about denying or suppressing the emotions, but just holding them and at times setting them aside to then see another perspective and then holding them together. So I really appreciate that clarification. Um, well, with that, I would love to take us to the end of our presentation, and so I am going to go ahead and share my screen again. Um, replace current share. There we go. All right. So with that, thank you all so much for being a part of this. And Chris, thank you again for your presentation. It was remarkable. There was a lot of great conversation in the chat. Thank you everybody for your questions. So once again, we remind you to become a regular, please, with our monthly webcast on the second Wednesday of the month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. You can go to stewardshipnetwork.org/webcast to see our upcoming webcasts and register for them months in advance if you would like. So we have next month, June 2025, we have From Litterbox to Land Conservation at Big Rock Valley with Jared Reibel of the Edward Lowe Foundation. Then in July of 2025, we have Change on the North Coast, Indigenous Partnership and Public Lands with Victor M. Bjelejek and Shalana De Silva with California State Parks. And then in August of 2025, we have Ecology of Red-Headed Woodpeckers in a Threatened Ecosystem, Insights from a Long-Term Investigation in Oak Savannas with Alina West from University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And last but certainly not least, reminder, stewardshipnetwork.org/spring to do all of your spring challenge reporting. We really love getting your data as often as possible, so please report as soon as you are able, and that also enters you into the spring challenge boosts. And we love your stories and photos. They are such a wonderful representation of the work that you do, so please keep sharing them, and we will continue to share those on our platforms via social media and email. And you can check on the site for easy ways to help us spread the word about the Spring Challenge. So with that, once again, thank you all so much, and we hope to see you next month. Take care.